Today we are at Vermont Violins and Richelieu with owner Kathy Reilly. So Kathy, apart from being owner, you're a part of two very important organizations, VSA, which is the Violin Society of America, and the International Alliance of Violin and Bow Makers for Endangered Species. Today, we are going to do a talk on tonewoods and FSC certification.
Thank you. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Fantastic. Kathy, for those unfamiliar with FSC certification, can you explain what it means and why it matters specifically to the luthier world?
So, climate change has kind of altered how our wood sourcing is going to go in the future. The trees, the way they grow, where they grow, are going to start shifting. And we have assumed that this wood is just here. We use wood in large quantities, not just as individual makers, but as an industry. And for us to think that our ability to go out and pick a tree out of the woods, in 60 years or 80 years, we might have to shift that perspective. So sustainable sourcing, whether it's through FSC, SFI, PEFC, these are three big international organizations that do sustainable wood sourcing, or just on our own, thinking about the resource as a limited resource as opposed to an unlimited resource where we have infinite choices is kind of where we're heading. FSC, Forest Sustainable Council certification is a useful way, as are the others, of being able to trace the source of the wood and that it was sustainably harvested. That concept of sustainable harvesting is going to vary. I can't say that everybody is going to agree with how a lumber yard is sustainably identifying the way that they harvest. But it does allow us to ascertain that it is legally harvested, that someone is watching how it is being harvested and thinking about the future of that tree resource. The other thing for us to keep in mind as instrument makers is that we use probably 1% of the wood that is harvested by a lumber company or a logging company. That isn't because we can go out and pick the individual trees and select those 1%. It's because of all the trees that are cut, maybe 1% actually meets the specific requirements that we are looking for right now. And as things go into the future, we may not be able to be as selective about the wood that we're choosing.
So what are the most common tonewoods used in violin and viola making? And which of these are now facing sustainability concerns?
Historically, we tend to use European tonewoods like Picea abies, which is a spruce species that comes from Europe. It's very common in Europe. And different maple species also from Europe. Part of that is because the violin making tradition came over from Europe to the United States as different populations migrated over here, whether it was Germany, Italy, France. They brought with them that violin making tradition, and they were used to and familiar with those woods, so we would go back to Europe and source those woods and bring them over here too. That made sense. Right now, with climate change, Western Europe, which is where we source a lot of our wood, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Bosnia, Italy, is being heavily impacted by climate change, and temperature and humidity is changing. That means those tree species and the environment in which they are growing is also changing. There has been, over the past 50 to 100 years, more and more use of North American tonewoods in instrument making in the US. And if you talk to some of the people who source tonewood in the US, some of the loggers, some of the tonewood suppliers, of which there aren't that many, they will say that that tonewood also shows up in European instrument making because of the shipbuilding industry. And their thought is that as they were importing wood into Venice for building ships, they were also bringing that American wood into those ports, and some of the makers were using it in their instrument making. I don't know how much of that is true or not, but it is conceivable. One of our goals as instrument makers has been to diversify the types of wood that we're using in instrument making, in part to explore different kinds of sounds for specific instrument types which are difficult to make sound good, like the fractional violas, and seeing if there are qualities to the wood that are useful for those categories. The other is that in the interest of having access to a broader population of species and being able to decrease the impact of instrument building on any specific species in a specific area, that this might be useful for us in the long run.
So Kathy, how does FSC certified wood differ from non-certified wood in terms of availability, cost, and quality? Are there any tonal differences with that luthiers have noticed?
So we were just in Switzerland sourcing spruce for our own instrument making and for selling to other makers who are interested in FSC certified wood. That wood is the same wood that's been logged for hundreds of years for violin making. And the fact that it's FSC certified has more to do with the fact that in Switzerland, in those high elevation forests around Bergum, the Swiss government has had restrictions on how those trees are cut because of avalanches and erosion control. So those practices for sustainability have been in place since the early mid-1800s. It just so happens that those are the same requirements that are needed for FSC certification. So for this tonewood supplier, it was like an easy fit. They were like, we're already doing this stuff. So we just got the FSC certification because we met all of the requirements and we thought it was important. They think it's important for people to realize that having these intact, diverse forest structures are responsible forestry practices, not just for tonewood, but for lumber sourcing in general. Does the wood differ? No. In that case, it does not differ at all. In the US, tonewood supplies are a little bit trickier. FSC certification requires that the whole supply chain be FSC certified. So the land where it's logged, the logger, the sawmill, the transportation has to carry that FSC certification. So we need to know that the wood that is on that lumber truck is the FSC certified lumber, that it's going to the mill, and then that it's going to the person who's doing the manufacturing or the instrument builder. Then the instrument builder or manufacturing has to be FSC certified, and theoretically the shop selling the instrument, in order for it to be sold as an FSC certified instrument, the shop selling it also has to have that FSC certification. So that whole supply chain allows us to trace the wood back to its source, and we're going to see that becoming important not just in the Lacey Act declarations, where we have to show that the wood is legally harvested, but also in the upcoming European Union deforestation regulations, where we have to show that it was sustainably harvested. Does that change the wood that we have access to? Potentially, yes, because there are a limited number of sources for FSC certified wood. The same thing is true in terms of a process for SFI. And that gets to, in the United States, sawmills. We have a limited number of sawmills or small mills that will cut the wood for us in a way that we're reducing runout and that we have the proper grain direction. So that is the kind of the point in the FSC supply chain, where in the United States we have a critical issue that we're going to have to resolve long term if that kind of certification is our goal.
So what challenges do small-scale luthiers face when trying to source FSC-certified tone woods compared to larger manufacturers?
Larger manufacturers like Weyerhaeuser and the big lumber companies have their own forests. They buy their land, they have their own mills, they cut the wood to the specifications that they want, they have their own transportation systems. Basically, they own their entire supply chain. For smaller manufacturers like us or for individual makers, we do not own our own supply chain. We've been working with Seth Kimmel, who's been a really important partner for the past 2 years, trying to build that supply chain for our own in-house manufacturing. And in a lot of ways, this is a test case for us. It's like, is this feasible for us to do in the United States? Interestingly enough, in Switzerland, the source for the tone wood that we have also has their own supply chain. They have contracts for getting the wood from sustainably sourced locations. They own their sawmills. They own their transportation. So again, and they're not as big as Weyerhaeuser, but they are a relatively large manufacturer of tone wood. So for an individual maker to go out and try and source that, we would have to build up the sawmills and our tone wood supply kind of resources within the United States. It's one thing we're working on, but I think we need more people to do that as well. The other thing is that it might be something where we have to create an organization and build the demand for sustainable harvested tone wood in the United States. It's not going to be something that's cheap and easy and fast to develop. It's going to require some investment, and it's going to require a known market, and that's basically us as violin makers.
So beyond spruce and maple, what alternative tone woods are being explored and have any shown promising acoustic properties?
Yeah, this is the really fun part. I was talking with Stephanie Voss, who's been doing something similar with her manufacturing in Germany. So historically, makers used woods that were available. So you would see fruit woods, you would see willow species, you would see different poplar species in the instruments. They weren't building necessarily as many as we are on a commercial scale, but they were testing out different woods and would use them if they thought that wood was going to be a good option or because it was available and affordable at the time. So Stephanie Voss has done something similar. She's looked at oak, she's looked at different species in Europe to see how they change the sound and how that opens opportunities for us in the market as instrument builders. We've been doing that. We've been looking at myrtle, we've been looking at cherry, we've been looking at different species of maple. Seth Kimmel and the base makers have looked at Port Orford cedar, which is actually a large species. We've got Sitka spruce, Engelmann spruce, pine, sugar pine is another species that's being tested out for violin making and for bass making. So there's also this opportunity for us in that different instruments might work well with a wider diversity of species as well. You know, we tend to look at the violin making as kind of the source of, okay, this is the ideal wood to use, and this is the sound that we're looking for. But when you look at different instruments like cellos, basses, and violas, maybe there are other sound colors that these woods offer that would be useful for us. Another thing to keep in mind is I had this really interesting conversation with a teacher in a private school out in Washington State, and she was saying, Kathy, you know, the students that are coming up through the ranks today who are playing bowed string instruments are exposed to a much wider genre of types of music than I was when I was growing up. You know, they've got reggae, they've got, you know, African music, they've got, you know, South American, Latin music, they've got everything, and then you've got the electronic field. Their sense and concept of sound is much broader and much more diverse than what we're used to in the classical community. And that's not saying that we shouldn't make classical instruments with a classical sound. It is saying that if we want these bowed string instruments to be popular, not just available, but popular for future generations, having a wider perspective and diversity of sound might help make that happen in a way that just focusing on the classical sound that we're used to and identify with would.
So Kathy, from a player's perspective, should musicians be asking luthiers about the sourcing of their instruments? How can they make more environmentally conscious choices?
This is really important because ultimately this is going to impact the people who purchase and own these instruments. There is a project, there are projects to develop a digital product passport so that when musicians are traveling across boundaries of different countries, they will be able to document the woods that are used in their instrument, that those woods are legally sourced, and that hopefully they're sustainably sourced as we move forward with building supply chains. Those digital product passports would go with the instruments. And what we'd like to do is make those digital product passports in a way that as you change a fingerboard, change pegs, get repairs done, you're able to update those digital product passports. And that they are compliant with regulations in various countries. And this is a big deal because we have to create databases then that work both in the European Union, with European Union safety regulations about access and protection of data and security, Asia, and lots of variety over there, the US, Canada, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand. All of these countries are starting to create regulations about legal sourcing of wood and some of them increasingly sustainable sourcing of wood. So for musicians, they need to know that their instrument can go from country to country with them if that's how they're making their living, or if their high school orchestra is going to travel over to Czechoslovakia, like Prague, and do concerts, or if their band is going to go travel and needs to be able to show that their instruments are legal. It is our responsibility as makers and tonewood suppliers to be able to protect the instruments that are being built and the musicians so that they know that their investment is safe going into the future. In some ways, it's irresponsible for us to just say, okay, this is wood, given that we know these regulations are coming. And the reason why these regulations are important and coming often has to do with climate change. And those younger generations are living with that in a way that some of us who are older are not. And they care. And we need to respect that as instrument makers.
So Kathy, how has the conversation around sustainable wood sourcing changed your relationship with suppliers and customers over the past decade?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it makes me think more about the wood that I'm choosing, where it's coming from, why I'm choosing it. I am often, much to the chagrin of my luthiers, much more open to wood where the grain direction isn't perfectly straight or the run out is a little more than they want, because I know that when I talk to the loggers and I talk to the tonewood suppliers, that we're already dealing with such a small percentage of the wood that's out there. And if we then take that 1% and say we only like 20 or 30%, there's a lot of wood that's getting wasted. And if you wonder where that wood goes, often it goes to China because we've rejected it in large batches and it's less expensive. And those instruments are the basis for our rental companies and the basis for the musicians who later come back and buy the more expensive instruments. So we don't have as much choice as we think we do. And our decisions have implications that go well beyond the instrument that we are making in front of us. We are all part of the cycle. Whether we choose to buy that piece of wood or not, that wood is cut for tone wood. And we can't just say, okay, that's somebody else's problem. They're wasting more wood than I am. If we're going through and rejecting 60 or 70% of the wood that's cut for us.
So Kathy, are there certification costs or logistical hurdles that make FSC compliance difficult for independent violin shops?
Yeah, any of the three major organizations for sustainable certification, there are financial hurdles to doing this. I think like we just got our renewal, our annual renewal, and it's like $2,800. And that is an annual cost. And then there are the costs of the initial setup. That varies depending on where you are located, what you are applying for, which organization you are working with, and how the process works. There might be options for us as a community because a lot of us are smaller individual makers that we can pull together and have a group certification of some sort. And that would be a good thing for us to explore. We're going to talk about that at the VSA in the next convention in November because we're going to have a representative from the SFI. And, you know, looking at ways to make this accessible and affordable for us. I also want to say that there are sustainable sources out there that are not related to one of these three major organizations. Switzerland has what's called the Swiss Wood Certification. So their wood is sustainably certified. It's just done through the Switzerland government. In Canada, you know, the Canadian government controls the logging process. So they have one of the largest sustainable sourcing programs in the world. It's just not necessarily FSC, SFI, PEFC. So there are ways to do this in a way that does not have those associated costs. What does happen under those conditions is that then you have to track that paperwork individually. And that is a cost. It's just kind of a hidden cost. So depending on your organizational systems, whether we want to do that through some kind of larger organization, there are other ways to do this. But the nuts and bolts are that we have to be able to show where it was cut, that it was legally cut, that it was sustainably cut, and that we can trace it through the whole supply chain to know that that tree that was cut was the same one that we used to make the instrument at the end of the day.
So Kathy, what has been the impact of using sustainable tone woods on the in-house manufacturing process for Richelieu instruments?
We have a team of makers who, you know, some of us grew up here, some of us come from other places. We've had a lot of great conversations about what makes good tone wood for the instrument models that we're making. And because we're aware of the issues with climate change, with sustainable sourcing, and we've all kind of grown together going through the process, often we're tracking behind people who are purchasing wood or producing wood for guitar manufacturing. So we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we recut this piece of wood that was really, you know, logged and milled for guitar making to make it work for what we're doing, what's important, what isn't, what makes a good piece of wood, how important is having all of this beautiful flame, is that really critical to the sound and to what we're trying to do? How can we use these instruments to communicate to the next generations and to musicians today what these issues are and how valuable this instrument that's in front of them and this wood that they are using, how unique that really is out there. And, you know, it's been really wonderful to work with the students and the players who are coming up through the ranks and see their passion for the sustainability mission, how much that means to them, and how attached they become to their instruments because they know the story of where the wood came from, and because they know that we care about this being available for them for future generations as well. So that attachment and that kind of relationship with them that's at a different level means a lot to us as the makers and the team. So that's been really special.